Meanwhile, the United States has announced progress in negotiations on Ukraine. According to Special Representative Steve Bitkoff, the parties have managed to significantly narrow the range of key disagreements. Washington notes that the very fact of dialogue between the parties is already an important step forward.
The discussions focused on narrowing the scope and resolving the remaining issues in order to move toward a comprehensive peace agreement. We welcome the ongoing engagement to resolve outstanding issues, recognizing its importance for broader global stability. Steve Witkoff, Special Representative of the U.S. President on the social network X.
Meanwhile, Russian troops continue to terrorize the Ukrainian population. Just this week, the Russian army used 1,500 attack drones and more than 1,200 guided aerial bombs for attacks. This was reported by the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. In addition, the aggressor has increased crude oil sales to earn extra income due to the weakening of sanctions. Zelensky noted that profits give the Kremlin a sense of impunity and the ability to continue the war.
It is necessary for the pressure to continue and for the sanctions to remain in effect. Russia's shadow fleet should not feel safe in European or any other waters. Tankers that fund the war budget can and should be stopped and blocked, not just let go. I thank every leader who makes the appropriate decision. This brings a just peace closer. Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine, on Telegram.
A NATO delegation led by the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, Admiral Pierre Van Doy, visited Ukraine. This is the first visit of this level since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This was reported by Deputy Head of the President's Office, Pavlo Polisa. According to him, last year's experience of the Defense Forces' participation demonstrated to partners the latest methods of warfare. In training scenarios, Ukrainian teams showed a significant advantage. They also discussed the development of the joint NATO-Ukraine Center, which was officially opened at the beginning of last year. We will discuss this topic with our guest on the air, as well as talk about the bilateral meeting in Miami. Well, actually, let's talk about today's visit. Yaroslav Teleshun is joining us. He is a candidate of political sciences. Yaroslav, welcome to the Freedom Broadcast.
Hello there, and welcome to our presentation today.
So, regarding the visit of the NATO delegation, which I just mentioned, let's start with that. The Deputy Head of the Office of the President, Mr. Pavel Polisa, made a very interesting statement on this matter, saying that today Ukraine is not a consumer of security, but a producer. It sounds more harmonious in Ukrainian, but for our viewers to understand, I translated it. Why does the strengthening of Ukraine's position, which is clearly noticeable to all of Ukraine's partners, not affect the negotiations regarding peace in Ukraine? Or at least maybe it doesn't influence things enough, does it?
Look, I think it does have an impact, no matter how much certain individuals might wish otherwise. They take into account the experience and the tools that Kyiv has at its disposal. In this case, we simply understand that a certain inertia in thinking, certain narrow corporate interests, the fundamental elements of the current world order. If we are specifically talking about the landscape of global politics, they influence the fact that certain key international players are still very cautiously considering potential changes to the existing status quo among various actors, let's say, within the broader security process. Therefore, in this case, I wouldn't say that there haven't been any shifts. There are shifts in tectonic perceptions. It's just that they haven't yet reached the critical mass that would become a bifurcation point and change the perception of Kyiv and Ukraine. Overall, as a true subject, not just one that demands support for ensuring security, but one that can itself generate security in a given region.
The negotiations in the trilateral format were suspended after the start of the US and Israeli operation in Iran. And as if this could or should have happened only at the initiative of the United States of America, but in fact it is happening at Russia's initiative. And here, it's interesting to consider the logic behind this. And in general, would the card of Russia-Iran cooperation in the trilateral negotiations have played against Russia?
It does play a certain role. Why? Because after all, it's quite easy. We can look at the dynamics of internal processes within the United States itself. Yes, in this case, we understand that there are delays because key representatives of the US negotiating delegation are involved in the Middle East agenda. Naturally, of course, the dispersion of their attention leads to the fact that the United States postpones a number of various issues. Plus, we understand that there is a security element here as well, which also affects, in fact, the dynamics on the part of the United States. If we talk about the Russian Federation and its ties with Iran, then undoubtedly we have repeatedly heard how various American or global journalists from different countries have asked this question to President Trump and his entourage regarding the fact that there is direct cooperation between Moscow and Tehran, and in fact what Washington's reaction to this will be, especially in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine. In this case, we saw that the questions were definitely not super comfortable for President Trump, and he tried to avoid them as much as possible or give very vague answers. And this, in fact, may be evidence that in any case. These questions and the status quo that exists will be used by President Trump's opponents in the internal political struggle. Therefore, I think we will hear about this connection more than once. And these facts will be referenced and used to criticize President Trump and his administration regarding the fact that the limited support for Ukraine in its confrontation with Russian aggression is reflected in the war in the Middle East. I would even go further. That negative and rather emotional reaction from President Trump, saying that the United States does not need either the experience or the technologies that Ukraine possesses in order to counter Iranian drones. This, in a certain way, is also the case. It is a response and an indication of just how sensitive this issue is for President Trump, because we understand that the official assistance proposed by Kyiv directly, essentially, let's say, hits a weak spot. It is Washington's desire in one form or another to cooperate with Moscow. And in turn, this creates a point of tension in the logic of deploying certain actions. Therefore, I think that again, this issue is not exactly on pause for now. Perhaps it just hasn't reached its peak yet in terms of discussion and attention, but I believe that both the international community and in fact American citizens will definitely return to it more than once. I think we will see this especially clearly and tangibly as the midterm elections in the United States Congress approach.
Yaroslav, is it really the case that cooperation with Moscow is what interests the US most, in particular Trump? Or is the main goal still to distance Russia from China and in this way perhaps weaken China? Still, it seems to me that the goal here is more global because we somewhat distort reality when we say that suddenly, in the midst of a full-scale war, the United States is very eager to cooperate with Russia. I still think that's not quite the case, or at least not entirely so.
No, look, you are absolutely right. In this case, I was simply looking at it from the perspective of tactical moves. Yes, you are absolutely right. The global goal of the United States of America is to maintain the current high status and to strengthen the hegemony of the United States of America. And of course, Washington sees Beijing as the key opponent and main competitor. And in this case, when we talk about cooperation between Washington, Beijing, and Moscow, we should first of all understand that Moscow is not an end in itself for Washington. Moscow is nothing more than a tool for achieving the strategic goals of the United States. That is, the policy that President Trump tried to actively promote from the moment of his inauguration, the so-called Kissinger in reverse approach, was an attempt, and as we can see, there are still ongoing attempts to separate the Russian Federation and its resource base from the needs of China. This remains a key focus of Washington's attention. Therefore, in this case, you are absolutely right. That is, Russia itself is not an end goal for the United States of America. Moreover, if we look at their updated national security strategy, Russia is not considered at all as any kind of possible competitor to the United States. So in this case, Russia is a tool for Washington's broader actions and objectives. Therefore, when I talk about cooperation, I mean in the short term. If we are talking about regulating perhaps the conflict in the Middle East, developing the Arctic, and so on. But again, all of these are elements and steps of Washington's more strategic approach, where Moscow's role, this is merely the role of a tool which allows you to maintain the current status quo and strengthen your positions.
You know, it's especially bizarre to hear about cooperation with a country that should be isolated, at least under the current regime, I mean. Let's move on. The Kremlin promises to return to the format of trilateral negotiations, but as a rule, Russia makes promises only to break them. Will it be necessary to force Russia to resume the format? And in general, when it comes to coercion or the use of force, I don't mean in a military sense, since diplomacy can also be tough and bold. So everything related to force, could that still be directed by the United States of America towards Russia? Or towards anyone, but not towards Russia?
Why? It could be towards Russia as well. Look, I base this on several factors. When we talk about President Trump's foreign policy course, first and foremost, his decisions and actions are based on his own internal needs and interests. In this case, we saw a trend of declining support for President Trump's policies within the United States itself. As a result, I can assume that for President Trump and his inner circle, this became a logical step. And this so-called small victorious war was seen as a logical step. And in fact, the Middle East and Iran were chosen as the target in order to demonstrate some rather high-profile successes. In President Trump's foreign policy on the eve of the United States congressional midterm elections. And in this case, we saw that perhaps the initial goals set by the White House were not achieved for a number of reasons. Therefore, in this situation, I proceed from the fact that if the conflict in the Middle East drags on, President Trump starts to suffer more and more from it. Reputational losses, and in this case, we are already seeing the numerical indicators of the cost of the war. I actually just recently saw, if I'm not mistaken, that the New York Times published that according to their calculations, every minute of the special operation, the US military operation in the Middle East, costs $1.3 million. And in fact, according to various economists' estimates, this military conflict could cost from 600 billions to even more than $1 trillion, especially if we are talking about the consequences of this military campaign for the United States of America. Therefore, of course, President Trump will need to demonstrate some results, if not in domestic policy, then in foreign policy. And in this case, of course, he might try to switch to another topic, namely Russia's war against Ukraine, given the fact that both the top leaders of the Iranian regime and President Putin are considered to be key villains within a wide range of social and political studies. Among the American population, when it comes to leaders of other countries, of course, the Ukrainian President Zelensky, is the most popular foreign leader in the United States. If we are not talking about representatives of their own establishment, then in this case, of course, there may be an attempt to once again resolve or change the status quo in Russia's war against Ukraine in order to try to gain these additional points ahead of, once again, the midterm elections. Given how the situation is unfolding, I wouldn't be surprised if things really do develop in exactly that direction. Do you mean by increasing support for Ukraine, for example, or by changing the status quo in Russia's war against Ukraine? President Trump, based on his interest in domestic politics and his desire to strengthen his position ahead of the elections, may decide to increase support and pressure. Increasing support, we're talking about Ukraine, and to intensify his pressure on the Russian Federation. So I wouldn't rule out that possibility. We might see that as well. Although, again, we understand that when we talk about President Trump's policy, it is characterized by a great deal of chaos in his actions. And in this case, chaos is not a tool, but rather an accompanying element of the decision-making process. So again, we can't say with 100% certainty that the situation will develop according to this scenario, but I wouldn't rule out that this is one of the possible options for the future.
Thank you, Yaroslav, for joining the Freedom Broadcast and sharing your opinion. It was very interesting. Yaroslav Chereshun was with us, candidate of political sciences.